All right, everyone. Welcome to Fuzzy Logic 2022. This is Brain Hacks Done Quick. I've got a lot to cover, and we've got about 50 minutes to do it in, so it'll go a little bit fast, but the VOD will be available, as well as we're going to make the slide deck available for you in case you want to review. So, brain hacking, huh? What do we mean by brains? Well, there are a few ways to look at it. We talk about brains in philosophy, biology, and psychology. Personally, I am trained in cognitive science, which is an interdisciplinary field that covers all three of those things. And what do we mean by hacking? Well, there is a concept of states of consciousness within the brain. And we're going to talk about some common methods to access and manipulate those states of consciousness. So, brain hacking. How do you hack your brain? We're going to talk about a couple techniques. Psychological. This is what's used in marketing to get you to buy stuff. It's also basically a way to associate a state with other states that are similar to it. We're going to talk about conditioning. Conditioning is a little bit, music is intentional. Conditioning is a little bit like an advanced version of priming. That's when you link a stimulus and a response directly. And we're going to talk about how to set achievable goals to break down large tasks into smaller pieces that your brain can understand and accomplish. Then we're going to go into a little bit of an advanced brain hacking thing. We're going to talk about how the brain makes decisions and how to use that process to achieve longer-term goals that are harder for your brain to wrap itself around. If we have time, we're going to do a demonstration and some Q&A at the end. I don't know if we'll get there in time, but I am going to go a little bit fast, so hopefully. So who am I, and why should you care? Well, as you all know, I am seeliefae. I'm a member of the Edge Case Collective. I was one of the founding members, so you know I'm cool. I'm a retro streamer and a programmer. I've worked on a number of game randomizers as well as other tools and stuff. Professionally, I'm Devin Corwin. I actually have a degree in cognitive science from Indiana University, class of 2008. While there, I minored in linguistics and religious studies. Those are attached to my cognitive science degree. I also have additional degrees in East Asian languages and culture and in computer science. So, what are brains? Hi Nut, you're awesome. What are brains? This is a very interesting question, but it has a very easy answer. They're the meat thing inside your skull. But what does that mean? Well, first we have to talk about what are minds. Minds are probably what you're actually thinking about when you're thinking about thinking. Brains are these cool little pink fleshy things. They've got a bunch of parts in them, but at the basic level, they are general purpose predictive devices. The brain sees a state and it tries to figure out what the next state will be, and that's the basic structure of the brain. That's basically what it does. It processes sensory input, which is why you see all these different kinds of structures in the brain. Those are hooked up to different senses and then to each other, which creates all of these little parts and places. These parts are actually in different places for different individuals, so it's hard to think about them as an actual anatomy of an actual brain, but you get a pretty good idea. This works by association between states and concepts. Brains are not run by formal logic. And the brain is actually just one of several systems that actually control the organism. You have a big feedback loop in your body with a bunch of other systems that are responsible for your decision-making and your actions. The brain is studied by both biology and by neuroscience. So what about minds? Well, minds are an abstract model that we have created to, yes, brains wiggle. An abstract model that we have created to understand ourselves and what we believe and what we think and all that other fun stuff. They don't actually exist as far as we can tell. You can't look at one, you can't poke one. There isn't one anywhere. So Rene Descartes suggested that, well, if the mind isn't located in the world, it must be separate from the world. we don't actually know if the world is real, but we do know that the mind is real because we have direct experience of thinking. So I think, therefore I am. Obviously, this is wrong. There's no other way to put it. The world is, in fact, real. So about 100 years later, Kant came and said that we are actually defined by our ability to experience the world. We may not be able to experience the world directly, but we contain a representation of that world within our mind, and it is the interplay between those two that causes us to become who we are. So the mind interacts with the world via these representational states. So the mind is the domain of philosophy, but since we can't measure it, since we can't look at it, since we can't poke it, it's not actually that useful for science. It's very much a domain of philosophy. So if those are both wrong ways of looking at things, what's left? Well, yeah, the I is a very interesting thing to presuppose there. And I could talk about Descartes all day, but basically his stuff was religiously motivated rather than scientifically motivated. So, like, I appreciate that, but it's not the frame of reference that we think is useful moving forward. And basically all of this is about what is correct might be cool and is correct, but what is useful is more important. So anyway, if those are wrong, what's left? We have psychology. Psychology sidesteps all of that by studying people's self-reported experiences and believing them, and also it studies human behavior. But this can go a bit too far because we end up in behaviorism, which says we can't look at minds, we can't measure minds, let's just ignore minds and talk about behavior directly. And the behaviorist movement is where we ended up with stuff like the Skinner box, if you've heard of that. Skinner was a behaviorist who studied organisms and conditioning and basically figured out how to hook birds on crack, hook rats on cocaine. Basically not kinds of experiments that we can perform ethically on humans, and not really kinds of experiments that we want to perform on animals anymore. So the behaviorist way of thinking kind of hit a dead end in experimental stuff, but it's still used a lot in advertising and marketing today. What replaced it more or less was computationalism, which is, we know the brain is not a computer, but we can model the mind and we can model cognition as a computer. And actually, this is where we got the von Neumann architecture, the thing that all computers are based on, with a CPU and RAM and all that other fun stuff. So cognition is a manipulation of symbols in this system. Connectionism is kind of a different way of looking at this. That's where we get neural nets. And these are saying that the symbols are not actually directly represented in the brain, but are distributed throughout it. This was also kind of a dead end. It doesn't really help us usefully talk about the brain, but on the other hand, the things that came out of it led to deep learning artificial intelligence. So if you've seen like chatbots that can mimic human speech, if you've seen art bots that make cool AI art and stuff like that, those are actually done through the neural network algorithm. Backpropagation is the name of that algorithm. So psychology abandoned that line of reasoning, abandoned behaviorism and all that stuff, and started talking about social psychology. Beliefs, attitudes, and group dynamics between people were both easier to study and more useful to study. And we got embodied cognition, which unseated the brain as the seat of what we're talking about and preference of the entire organism and actually the world around it. And this is a return to studying the human through biology, but also takes some cues from social psychology. Embodied cognition is my preferred model, and it's got four kind of facets to it called the 4 E's. It is embodied, meaning you can't have a mind without a body. It is an extended mind, meaning that your mind includes things outside of your body that you rely on, such as your computer or your phone. If you're riding a bicycle, your self-conception includes that bicycle, and so on. It is embedded in the world, meaning if you don't have any sensory input, you don't have a mind. Your mind only exists in relation to that world. And it is inactive on that world. It's a two-way relationship. The world shapes you, but you also act in the world and shape it. So what about cognitive science? Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary field that marries all of these things and a couple other things. And it studies mind, thought, and cognition in a scientific way. This includes such things as attention, decision-making, learning, memory, perception, consciousness. That's a big loaded word. And it's a relatively new field. We started the cognitive science program in the 1950s. It's had a few shakeups since then, but this is basically the frame that I'm going to be referencing during the rest of this talk. So, what does it mean to hack brains? Now that we know what we're talking about, how do we use that? Well, first we have to talk about consciousness. You've probably seen a diagram similar to this. This is a folk psychology understanding of consciousness. We don't actually have a good definition of consciousness. So this isn't scientific, but it's useful. It's close enough, right? Our intuition says that we have some sort of conscious mind that we're aware of, that we have thoughts in, that can make decisions and stuff, but we also have this sort of subconscious or unconscious mind that has things like feelings and motivations and memories that we might not actually be consciously aware of, but which drive our actions and reactions and decisions. Some psychologists have attempted to approach this through the idea of a filter of attention, where if you look into a room, per se, you see all of the objects in that room, but your mind filters the things that it thinks you need to know, and it only tells your conscious mind the specific features that are relevant, while ignoring everything else. Like, you might not actually see the color of a picture, or the texture of the wall, or that there's a fly buzzing around, or whatever, until it's relevant to you. There's also a notion that you can have automatic processing or action via your unconscious mind, such as if you are running on autopilot. We'll be talking about that a bit later. Jung actually took this a step further and said that there was a collective unconscious of culture and archetypes. Your brain developed within a culture, and you got some signifiers of that culture. Yes. You have some signifiers of that culture that shaped your brain. And so this sea of culture and archetypes and how you relate to people is part of the lowest level of this decision-making process. And whether it's actually the lowest level is debatable. Whether it exists or not, I don't think is debatable. I do think something like this is going on, especially if you understand a language. So all of this stuff is useful, but it's very hard to measure, it's very hard to quantify. We can't really say this is pre-conscious, this is subconscious, this is unconscious. It's all wishy-washy stuff that you can reason about, but you can't actually measure. So what can you measure? Well, there's a concept called states of consciousness. And these are measurable, these are repeatable. You have normal waking consciousness, your day-to-day, what you experience when you know that you can experience things. But there are also altered states of consciousness. This is when you notice a very specific difference in your level of attention or in your way of thinking or something like this. And there are a few very well-known states of consciousness. For example, sleep, dreaming, meditation, and drugs are all very common altered states of consciousness. If you're asleep, obviously you're having a very different experience of yourself than if you're awake. Dreaming can be measured. We can actually tell when you are dreaming and when you are not by looking at your brain waves. This is where you hear things like the alpha, beta, and theta waves. Those are actual real brain waves that you can measure by hooking someone up to an EEG. So we can measure these altered states of consciousness. You can also look at this as levels of self-consciousness. Even in normal waking consciousness, you'll have levels where you are aware of yourself and levels where you are less aware of yourself. So for example, if you are immersed in a book or a movie, if you're really into the story, if you're really into the emotions and interplay of those characters, that's one level where you have basically annihilated the self, right? You're not thinking about yourself at all. You're only thinking about the story. On the other hand, you have mindfulness, where you're only thinking about the self, where you're aware of your thinking process. Those are very two different states of consciousness that are almost at opposite ends of the spectrum. Similar states of levels of consciousness, I should say, are trance, like hypnotic trance. Highway hypnosis. This is when you're driving a car and you arrive at your destination and you don't really have a memory of how you got there because your body just went on autopilot. You also do this when you're having a conversation or listening to music or something and not paying attention to the road, and yet you'll get to your destination without getting into any accidents. We also see this in flow. This is when you're in the zone and performing an activity. You can see a chart over here on the right by a cognitive scientist who is studying flow. Flow is basically, if you have a high skill level and a high challenge level, your conscious mind can drop away and you'll be in the zone performing unconscious or subconscious actions. Whereas if you have a lower skill level or a lower challenge level, you might not hit that area. If your challenge exceeds your skill, you might end up anxious and hyper-conscious of what you're doing. Whereas if your skill exceeds the challenge, you might end up bored rather than in the flow state. So the cool thing about states of consciousness is they can be intentionally and consciously manipulated. And this is how we're going to hack your brain. So how do you control your consciousness? Well, there's a bunch of different ways that are common or less common. The one you're probably thinking of is therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness therapy, hypnosis, etc. These are all very direct ways to manipulate consciousness. But there are simpler ways too. Music and art can have a very powerful emotional impact. Again, that is manipulating a state of consciousness. But even oratory and persuasion can manipulate someone's state of consciousness, either emotionally or rationally. Advertising and marketing is a big one. Advertising execs love to use priming, a technique we're going to discuss later, in order to manipulate your consciousness. And they often do this without you noticing. Religion is a big one. There are religious practices, for example, meditation or religious ecstasy are ways in which a religious practice can manipulate your consciousness. Religious ecstasy is, for example, if you're in a room and you're all singing and you get caught up in that group experience, that group emotion, yourself drops away and you only recognize the group. That's the state of consciousness that it could reach. Drugs are, of course, another way that you can control your state of consciousness. And there's a bunch of different drugs. They all work differently, and they all work differently in different people. So, how do you make use of this to hack your own brain? Well, I'm going to give you some examples, and I'm going to give you some instructions. And this is the practical part of the lecture. If you're not taking notes now, the slide deck will be available, but please do try these techniques at home. This is really cool. Yeah, flow comes up a lot in esports. Flow also comes up a lot in sports. You often hear it called in the zone. Like if you're playing basketball and you're in the zone, then you're performing all these actions automatically. Your conscious mind isn't noticing that this player is coming up on your left, but you're automatically reacting. You're automatically going around them. In martial arts, you hear Bruce Lee's famous statement of don't think, feel. That's talking about flow. That's talking about remove your conscious mind from the equation and let your training take over. Okay, so how to hack your brain. Take notes. The slide deck will be available later. The VOD will be on YouTube. Review it whenever you want. but these are going to be very useful, very practical bits of things you can use to hack your own brain. I'm going to talk about 3 problems and the techniques you can use to solve them. These problems are everyday issues that you have no doubt experienced. The strategies are grounded in a scientific approach through my cognitive science training, and the methods will be how to leverage those strategies to solve that problem in your life. The first problem we're going to talk about is attention and focus. This is like, have you ever tried to do something, but you can't get into the right frame of mind that you can actually do it? You keep getting distracted by things, you keep getting lost. A good way to think about this is that you are not in the right frame of mind. You are not in the right state of consciousness to perform whatever action is blocking you. So the strategy to overcome this is psychological priming. Brains are very associative by nature. If you give them one state, they will give you other related states. Exposure to one symbol or signifier also activates others that it believes are close to that symbol or signifier. This is used heavily in marketing to create unconscious influence. You might have noticed back when I told you who I was, that I gave you this very professional looking photo and I gave you my academic credentials. That again is priming you. I'm positioning myself as a person of authority that you should listen to. That was affecting your mental state and how you are approaching the rest of this information. If I had given you a different slideshow background, if we were playing a video game or something and I was saying this in a casual way, you would think about these things differently. But this priming has put you in a certain mindset of an academic space and a lecture where you will understand and absorb this information based on that. The other cool thing about priming is that exposure to one step in a sequence will automatically activate the next steps in your brain. So you can prime yourself to assume an appropriate state of consciousness in order to create that focus. And the way you do that is with ritual. So, to create a ritual, you're going to visualize performing the action that you want to have set up, and you're going to take some steps to prepare yourself to take that action. This could be putting on makeup. This could be donning appropriate clothing. This could be a certain warm-up technique or listening to a certain piece of music. For example, if you have a job interview, you might want to dress up for the job interview. You know, put on your suit, put on your nice dress, put on your jewelry. Even if the job interview is over the phone, you still want to dress up because you're creating the mental expectation within your own brain that you're going to be going into a job interview. Smell is especially powerful for this. Don't neglect that. Consider associating whatever action you perform, if it's like your work duties or something that you're going to be doing often, with something that you have on hand, such as incense or a cup of tea or some other thing, so that that can trigger your memory, which triggers the correct frame of consciousness. And the most important part here is that once you establish a routine, you have to stick to it. Definitely rely on archetypes, bringing up Jung again. The more you activate something that is associated with your activity, the stronger that association will be. Again, wear business clothes if you're going to do a business thing. Wear makeup if you're going to be streaming or performing. Listen to music that calms you down or amps you up if you're going to do something that requires you to be calm or to be amped. Problem 2, stopping spirals. I didn't really know a good way to phrase this, but if you are in a mental state where you don't want to be, there is a way to shock you out of it and into another mental state. Mindfulness exercises, for example, are one way in which therapists tell you to do this, but there are other ways too. What we are going to do to stop a spiral and shock you back into a neutral mental state is by use of a hypnotic trigger. This is a more advanced version of priming. It's also called conditioning. You might have heard of operant conditioning. We're going to associate a stimulus with a desired response. Now, when you hear stimulus here, you should be cautious because a lot of times in the literature, they talk about a specific stimulus, but they don't actually mean that specific stimulus. Your brain only memorizes states, so you're associating one state with another state and everything that implies. But through repetition, you can narrow down what those states are. So this can be an action, a memory, a state of mind, etc. on both ends, any two states. What we're going to do is we're going to associate an action with a state of mind. Associations are created via repetition of the stimulus and a response together. The concept in neuroscience is that neurons that fire together wire together. What this means is that if you always experience these two states together, then experiencing only one of them will automatically make your brain create the other. So I want to talk about the happy place. This is a concept that you see in psychotherapy sometimes. Basically, we're going to visualize a time or place, some sort of scene that is safe, restful, and happy, such as having dinner with friends on your birthday. This could be drawn from your memories, but it could also be a scene from a movie or a book. It could be something you invent, whatever you want. Then, once you have that memory set, once you know what's happening, where it's happening, you want to alter that memory to your liking. You can add smells. Again, smell is very important to memory. Add what kind of music is playing. Put your favorite people there. For example, if you have a good relationship with your grandmother, if she's very supportive to you, if she always offers you good advice, put her in your birthday party. It doesn't matter if she was actually there. She can be there in your happy place. Practice visualizing this happy place over and over and engage all of your senses. Feel the wood table, listen to your friends talk, remember the music that was playing, remember the smells that were there, visualize it and how it made you feel over and over. And as you visualize it, perform a certain action to create a hypnotic trigger. This can be anything. You could snap your fingers. You could slap your leg. You could say a certain word. Whatever you want. But you want to perform the two actions together over and over in order to create an association between those two states. With practice, you can use the trigger to drop into the happy place automatically. This does, in fact, work. You can try it. It does take a little bit of time to set up, but it is a very, very effective technique for shocking your brain into a more neutral state, from which you can more rationally analyze the situation and perform your whatever actions are necessary to get you safe. Problem 3, achieving goals. A lot of people have trouble with this. So the big problem with goals is that they can seem really big and really scary and hard to tackle. But we know from project management that there is a pretty easy way to think of goals that makes them more manageable. And these are called SMART goals. You have very specific goals. Make sure that you know exactly what needs to be done to fulfill this goal. Make sure you can measure progress towards it so that you know when you are on the right path and when you're not. Make sure the goal is achievable, that is within your control to accomplish. Make sure it is relevant, that the task that you're trying to do will help your ultimate goal, and that it is time-bound. It is something that can be completed and can be completed quickly. For example, the same day. And we're going to talk about intentions as a way to implement SMART goals. Break larger goals into smaller subtasks using those 5 criteria. Write each task as a single, easily understood sentence. And create a to-do list of them. It's that simple. For example, clean your room. For some people, at some times, this could be a task on its own. It's very clear. They know exactly what it means. That probably means they've done it a lot before. But if you need to emergency clean and you're not the kind of person who does that, you might want to break it up into tasks, like pick up all the trash, put all your laundry in a basket, take your dishes to the kitchen, clear off all your floors and surfaces, etc. Each of those little tiny tasks is specific, measurable, achievable, etc., right? So that's how you're going to tackle these kinds of goals. So now that you have all the basics down, I want to talk about some advanced brain hacking. This is going to build on what we've learned before, but it's also going to go into some interesting spaces. So please stick with me on this. We need to talk about decision making and how the brain makes decisions in order to handle this part. And the best way that I know to understand that is dual process theory. Basically, there are two channels of decision making in the mind. One is your intuition. It's fast and it's automatic. It's emotional and it's associative. This is where actions that you've trained a lot are. The four ways that this differs from the other path are in awareness. You're often not aware. Intentionality. You're often not taking these actions intentionally. Efficiency. These actions are often much more efficient, take much fewer mental resources than the other path. And controllability. You're often not controlling things through your intuition. However, your intuitive process is very, very accurate when you're familiar with the subject or you have lots of data. For most people, social interaction is an intuitive process because they have so much socialization that they understand how to read faces, how to understand emotions. Other people, not so much. They have trouble gathering that data or making use of it. For a lot of trained athletes, how to move is intuitive. How to catch a baseball is intuitive. Your conscious mind interferes with this. You want your intuition to take over. This system is very low level. We call it the adaptive unconscious sometimes because it has adapted to keep the organism alive. This is the baseline level of action that you are not even conscious of, that is automatic, that keeps you alive. The other channel we have is the channel of reason. This is when you're actually thinking about a problem explicitly. It is a lot slower, and you have to think in a sequential manner. You also have a limited capacity to process information in this way. You have to use your short-term or working memory. And studies have shown that you can usually only hold 5 to 7 things in short-term memory without using specific domain knowledge in order to chunk them, which means it's very difficult to reason about large problems. On the other hand, you can use it on novel subjects. Your intuition is best when you are very familiar with the domain, but your reason can be used on things that you have absolutely no idea about and that you've never encountered before. Your reason is what we call general intelligence because it can handle literally any task. Intuition is better, but can only handle tasks where you're familiar. Otherwise, you have to use reason. So, how do we tackle long-term goals with this knowledge in mind? Well, make use of the adaptive unconscious. The adaptive unconscious is better suited to running things day to day. It's a lot more effective, it's a lot more efficient. It doesn't tax your brain as much, and it often makes better decisions than you would make consciously. Leaving decisions to your intuition leads to better outcomes. This is true whether you're an expert or whether you're just familiar with the basics, the heuristics of how to tackle something. You often hear that you should sleep on it for large decisions. This is because when you're asleep, your conscious mind can't think about them, meaning it does not block the unconscious from doing so. So what if we could sleep on it, but for all decisions relating to our long-term goal? The only problem is, how? How do you do this? How do you make sure that your adaptive unconscious can handle the problem while your conscious mind steps to the side? Well, there is a very simple answer for that. It's called Sigil Magic. And yes, I'm serious. So, who am I and why should you care? I said before that I'm seeliefae, a member of ECC, and I said before that I'm Devin Corwin and I have a degree in cognitive science, and those things are true. But I didn't say that I'm also called Winterfae, that I'm trained in Hoodoo, which is an African diaspora religion, that I'm a practitioner of Kabbalah, which is a Jewish magical tradition, and that I'm familiar with many other religious and magical traditions. Sigil magic is one such magical practice. It's part of the chaos magic tradition, and it's very useful for this kind of thing. Sigil magic is an expansion on intentions that we learned about back in problem 3. It was invented by an English occultist named Austin Osman Spare. He was one of Crowley's disciples in Telema, but eventually abandoned Telema to create his own practice. Sigil Magic was refined by Grant Morrison, who you might have heard. They are a comic artist. They actually created the comic The Invisibles as a hyper sigil or combination of sigils. It is unrelated to previous magical usage of sigils. So you've probably seen things from the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Ars Goetia. You've probably seen things in like Full Metal Alchemist or Cardcaptor Sakura that are sigils. Those are not this practice. Those are a different tradition that also uses some of the same ideas. We're specifically talking about the chaos magic tradition of sigils. You actually see sigils every day all around you. For example, corporate logos are sigils. I put up the Pepsi logo, the new Pepsi logo here as a joke. This is actually a page taken from the document that pitched the new Pepsi logo. It is a very, very magical document. You should definitely give it a read sometime. It talks about the gravitational pull of Pepsi. It talks about the emotional impact of the Pepsi logo. And this is what a lot of people in advertising and marketing are doing. They are actually using magical techniques built on psychological priming in order to make you have a mental association with the product. And that ends up in stuff like this logo design. But all logos can be understood as sigils. These logos are intended to evoke a certain mental state, a certain response in the viewer, but also in the person creating the sigil. So you see these 8 artist signatures up in the top right. Those are all the same artist, but each of those signatures is used for a different purpose. And then in the bottom right, we actually have some chaos magic sigils. These were created by someone who uses the same kind of systems that I'm talking about. And that's the kind of sigils that I'll teach you how to make. So, how do sigils work? You have to define a specific intention. You can use those SMART goals back in part 3 to do that. You're going to imprint that intention on your unconscious mind and remove it from your conscious mind as completely as possible. With no conscious mind to interfere, the full power of the unconscious will be set towards making the intention happen. Basically, we're going to farm off the steps necessary to perform our task to that adaptive unconscious, to that intuitive reasoning system, while taking out the rational reasoning. So here's an example of how to create a sigil. There are tons of ways to do it. This is the one that was popularized by Grant Morrison in his book Pop Magic in 1998. You want to write out your intention, cross out all the vowels, cross out all the repeating letters, and use the remaining letters to create your sigil. So here's an example of a sigil that was created from the phrase, "I am safe and secure in my own skin." This person just literally took the letter forms and arranged them in a pleasing manner to create the sigil. That's one way that you can do it. The occultist Gordon White, who I've read a lot of his writing, talked about some techniques for effective use of sigils. For one, you should create intentions that are better. This means you should use positive words and the present tense. And the reason for this is because, again, the brain is very associative. You will associate positive words with other positive words. Similarly, you will associate negative words with other negative words. If you say that you don't want to do something, if you say not something, then that will activate other don'ts and nots and can'ts, which you don't want to put in your subconscious. It's a very associative space, so make sure you use positive words. You want to encode your desired end state. You don't want to encode a progressive state. So you don't want to say that you are trying to do something. You want to say that you have done something. If you are trying to do it, then your brain will work towards making you try to do it. Do or do not try. Gordon White gave us the concept of shoaling, which is don't activate a sigil on its own. Break your goal into smaller, achievable sub-goals. A single goal that might seem very, very difficult for you to achieve can be broken up into a bunch of different sub-goals. For example, one kind of facetious example is that flipping a coin and getting heads 10 times in a row has a very, very, very low probability. But each of those individual coin flips is a 50% shot. So if you attack each individual coin flip rather than the big goal, then each of those individual coin flips you can work towards better and smarter. He also popularized the concept of the robo-fish. Basically, this is an intention that you add to your shoal that is already true. And this directs the other pieces of the shoal in order to make them easier to achieve. Traditionally, when you make a sigil, you also destroy it. This is another aspect of removing it from your conscious mind. But Gordon White has a marketing background, and he says that a better way is to use low attention processing to reinforce the sigil. So low attention processing is, again, when I talked about levels of consciousness, I talked about the psychological idea that your subconscious processes all aspects of a scene, but your conscious mind only notices the ones that are relevant. This means that you can be heavily influenced by things that you are not consciously aware of. And we can make use of that here by putting your sigils in a place, in a space, where you see them every day, but they are part of the background. For example, in my bedroom, I actually have a wall that looks like this. I never look at these sigils. I never notice these sigils, but they are there every single day when I wake up. These were created by my wonderful partner, Trans Fairies, there in the chat. But you should do it for your own sigils too. Mix them up, leave them there for a while, take them down when you decide to take them down, but basically make them into a background part of your life. So that you see them but don't notice them, and that will reinforce them in your subconscious mind. Here is when I actually want to make a sigil to show you how it's done. So I don't know if anyone has an idea of an intention that I can make into a sigil for you. And I will make it here live. We only have about 5 minutes to do this, so I also might skip this step or show you a sigil that I created earlier today. Well, okay. Since we are low on time, I'll just show you a sigil that I created earlier today, and I'll show you how I got it. So we're going to want to have a positive word that encodes an end state. This is actually a really bad state to encode on its own, but one thing that some of you might be thinking about as you're here on Twitch is becoming a Twitch partner, becoming financially successful on Twitch. So let's use the phrase, I am a Twitch partner. Again, this is a very bad intention to make. What you should actually do is think about the things that you need to have to become a Twitch partner and encode those instead, such as increasing your viewer count, having a more consistent schedule, increasing the time of each stream, all of those kinds of things. But we're just going to put this one in. It's always possible to put in the big thing with all of your little things. So let's cross out all of the vowels. We don't care about vowels right now. And here are the letters we ended up with. M, T, W, T, C, H, P, R, T, R. And some of these are repeats. So again, we're going to kill all the repeats. This R and this T and this T. So we ended up with MTWCHPR. You can, of course, use these letters directly to create letter forms and stuff like that. But I find it more useful to do something like this. This is just a circle with all the consonants in it. And what we're going to do is we're going to draw a shape that connects those letters. So let's go from here over here somewhere. And from here we can go up here. And then we're going to go over this way. And then down this way. And then over to here. And over to here. So like this is, you know, a symbol. This is our first draft of a symbol. You could use this, but the idea is that you use these lines and these shapes and stuff, and you refine them and you draw them until you get something that is aesthetically pleasing. And I actually already created this sigil. It ends up looking like this. You can see how this is very influenced from those shapes. And so we have this little guy here. It is important that there is no relation between the form of the sigil and the intention. You should be able to look at this sigil and not have any idea what the intention was. This is also one of the reasons why you create a shoal of sigils. Even if you remember the 7 intentions that you encoded, which you probably won't, you won't remember which is which. And that is important because you want to encode it into your subconscious by using a process like this, but you do not want to have it in your conscious mind. So obviously me presenting here with this specific sigil, I know what this sigil encodes. So I'm probably not likely to forget that from my conscious mind very quickly. But if you made a group of 5 to 7 sigils and you shuffled them, and you didn't think about them, like you hid these letters as soon as you had done this step, you crossed this stuff out, so you're not even looking at it, not even thinking it, whatever. Each of those steps is divorced from the one before. That makes it easier to forget from your conscious mind. All right, so that's basically all I had. I wanted to end with a quote. This is a Crowley quote. I don't like Crowley, but this is still a good quote. And he says, "Magic is the science of understanding oneself and one's condition. It is the art of applying that understanding in action." And I hope that's what you have learned here today. We talked about some cognitive science ways to understand yourself, how you think and how you operate. And then we learned some ways to apply that understanding in action, how to manipulate those processes in order to improve your outcomes and your life. And that's exactly what magic is. So if you were following along, you are now a magician. That's basically all I had to say. Does anyone have questions? Thank you, Garby. Let me scroll up and see if I missed anything. Is that little squiggle a sigil? Yes, it is, non-binary. That is definitely a sigil. As to what it encodes, who knows? But also, letters are sigils. Also, corporate logos are sigils. Words are sigils. Anything that you intuitively understand or that evokes an emotional response or a change in consciousness is a sigil. It might not have been constructed in the way that I constructed these sigils, but it is a sigil. It can be understood as a sigil. You can sigil things for other people, but the effectiveness of your sigil work depends directly on how much your actions and your decisions and your attitudes can affect the outcome. Basically, you are making it so that if you encode a sigil for having more friends, having a more connected social network or something, you will be unconsciously more likely to accept invitations and talk to people and put yourself out there. That's the kind of thing that you're trying to do. So yes, you can sigil things for other people, but those will only be effective in so much that your behavior and actions can influence that outcome. Okay, if nobody else has anything, then I'm gonna cut. Next up, we have Leggy Starscream, Amethyst, Gemarine, and Zoe Vermilion doing a very silly Arpelago multi-world. I have no idea what games are going to be in it, but I bet it's going to be fun. That's all I have for you for today.